Good evening, everybody. My name is Ray Perman. I'm director of the David Hume Institute, and it's my pleasure to invite you to the first of our series of politicians and professionals 2017, in which we have the 5 party leaders to speak. Again, we're very happy to have the support of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Scotland, the Law Society of Scotland, the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, the Faculty of Advocates, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh Young Academy. We're particularly pleased to have the Young Academy because, as you all know, we aged 10 years during 2016, so it's good to have probably aged 10 years in 2017 as well. Good to have some people to bring down the average age, and Nasa Mir of the Young Academy will speak a little bit about the work of the Young Academy at the very end of the seminar here. Our speaker this evening is, of course, Kezia Dugdale, the leader of the Labour Party in Scotland. I was rather rude to Kez last year, for which I apologise now, by describing her as our 3rd Labour leader in 3 years, and I can make amends by that for saying she's our longest serving Labour leader, and we salute her, no, I was going to say indefatigability, but I think that phrase has probably been used too often, but her sustainability anyway, and welcome this evening. The context for this, when we started the series in 2014, was of course the Scottish independence referendum. In 2015, we had the UK general election. In 2016, we had the Scottish Parliament elections. And I think most of the sponsors who've collaborated in this thought, well, that's it, it's run its course. We can't do a 4th time. I mean, there are Scottish local government elections in 2017, but really politics is going to die down now. And how wrong we were. Brexit a year ago was a thought that very few people had. Now it dominates our lives. The independence referendum was something that was going to be once in a generation, and now there is a real prospect that we might have another one within a few years. So the context is very live, and I'm sure that we'll hear very interesting insights from Kez and from your questions afterwards. So without any more, I'll hand over to Kezia Dugdale.
Thank you, Ray, and you stole my joke. I was going to be the first to say I think I'm the first Labour leader in a while that's made it back to one of these. So thank you very much for inviting me along again. And when you talk about ageing 10 years, I think I know how that feels in this job as well. And can I start by thanking the David Hume Institute for having me here again. And since I spoke to you last year, the David Hume Institute has gone from strength to strength. And you continue to provide high-quality discussion, debate, and research to inform our national debate. Your reach and influence in Scotland continues to grow and is a fitting tribute to the man that this institute is named for. In preparing for this evening, I went back and reflected upon the speech that I gave last year, and then I spoke about the challenges we faced in Scotland, why I thought that education was the best response to changing times, and the ways in which I envisaged our economy growing into the future. Unsurprisingly, and Ray, you mentioned this in your opening remarks, the focus was on the Holyrood elections that were about to come, and in common with most of the leaders who spoke in that DHI series, the issue of the European referendum didn't come up at all. And a year ago, we appeared to be entering an election where the Scottish constitutional question was off the table, and a focus on the new powers of the Parliament was just around the corner. Today, we look on a world that has been turned upside down. And all of us in Scotland are now well used to these tumultuous times, but even the events of the last few years have left us unprepared for what has happened over the last 12 months. The 12 months we've just seen has delivered a difficult set of election results from my own party, a loss for Remain and for a majority of Scottish opinion in the EU referendum, the election of a demagogic populist as the President of the United States, and the question of a second Scottish independence referendum dominating our political debate once again. But despite all the political turmoil in the world beyond rooms like this and in the surroundings of Holyrood, the picture is much the same as it was a year ago. Unresolved questions about the future and the funding of our public services, continuing austerity policies from both the SNP and the Tory governments, and a whole slew of powers being delivered to the Scottish Parliament, which unquestionably makes it one of the most powerful devolved parliaments in the world. The world has been turned upside down, but as I've said elsewhere before, I believe the Scottish experience in 2014 was the canary down the mine for the wave of populism that we have seen since. Here in Scotland, the victory of populism in the form of SNP dominance has been resounding and is largely complete. It leaves us with the question I want to address this evening: where now? This is a question that applies to my own party as we prepare for the coming local government elections and carry on with the hard work of rebuilding for the next Westminster and Holyrood elections. But more importantly, it is a challenge to all of us who care about Scotland and the future of our country. Those of us who believe in using government not as a bully pulpit, but as a platform to make real and meaningful change. Because whether it is the First Minister's push for a second referendum, Theresa May's red, white and blue Brexit, or Donald Trump's call to make America great again, there is a need to get beyond sloganeering and posturing politics. We must provide people with a political debate that meets the scale of the challenges that we collectively face. In an inquiry concerning human understanding, David Hume said, "A wise man proportions his belief to the evidence." And all of us in public life, wise women as well as wise men, could do well to listen to that advice. So with that in mind, this evening I want to address three things in an attempt to answer the question, where now? First, the events of the past 12 months and what the response of political parties here in Scotland tells us about what might happen in the coming months. Second, how I believe we should respond to Brexit and the SNP's demand for a second independence referendum. And finally, what we need to do to address some of the fundamental questions facing the economy in Scotland in 2017 and the risks that we face if we don't do that. Before Christmas, Radio 4 presented a series of historians who gave their views about which year in history 2016 most closely resembled. Some said 1913, and the relatively stable years that came before the outbreak of the First World War. Others pointed to the 1930s and the toxic mix of extreme politics, a financial crisis, and the growing threat of instability. And others suggested it was more akin to 1979, and the beginning of the paradigm shift that led to neoliberal economics, the Big Bang, and the erosion of the institutions that had provided security and safety since the war. Regardless of the year they picked, however, every one of them agreed that 2016 was significant, a period of time which some people have referred to as a hinge year, one where significant disruption leads to great change and sets the direction for the generation ahead. In the past 8 years, we have seen people's faith in every major institution damaged. Parliament, the banks, the church, the BBC, the police service, and now even our national game. There are some of the institutions of our country which have provided stability for decades, whether down to corruption, carelessness, or downright evil. Every one of them has lost credibility and standing. At the same time, falling living standards and increasing instability in work and in our own communities has left people poorer, angrier, and more convinced that the people in charge just can't be trusted. Instead of responding to this with real thought and then action, the public perception, and much of the reality, if we're honest with ourselves, was that after the financial crisis and the pain caused by it, those same people went back to business as usual. The UK government continued to press ahead with an austerity agenda that punished those who were left poor and angry. Banks soon returned to paying large bonuses to the very people the public believed were responsible for the crisis. And in many circles, complacency set in that the worst was behind us and our politics and the way we run our economy should and would return to normal. It was that arrogance, largely demonstrated by a Conservative UK government, that was deeply out of touch with how people really felt, I believe led to the toxic conditions that created 2016. The reaction we saw last year wasn't created overnight, but it was long overdue. People from all walks of life voted for Brexit for a variety of reasons, but binding most of them together was a desire to bring about radical change in the way that we do things. I think the Brexit vote represents a failure of politics. It demonstrates clearly the extent to which people are willing to go to have their voices heard and to express their desire for real change. The same was true in Scotland in 2014. 45% of people voted in the knowledge that they were taking a significant risk, but that was, in their view, the price to pay for change. For politics to succeed, not just in the coming years, but in the coming decades, there needs to be an honest conversation about what politics can achieve and how we might make change happen. This is where I believe the other two major political parties in the Scottish Parliament are going wrong. Both the SNP and the Scottish Conservatives appear, since the Brexit vote, to be casting about for an expedient political position rather than working in the national interest. Our politics has become even more polarised, and more attempts are being made to reopen the divisions of the past few years than there are to heal them, an attempt to take our country forward. Both the SNP and the Tories talk of unity, but unity cannot be achieved by a politics that sees one half of the country constantly facing off against the other half. It is a recipe for a Cold War in Scottish politics, with both sides camped out around their positions, and our public services, our economy and our whole country suffering as a result. Ruth Davidson is so keen to present herself as the guarantor of the Union, but I think the Conservatives have done more to damage the case for the Union and the United Kingdom than anyone else. The tone-deaf response of David Cameron to the Scottish independence referendum was to launch English votes for English laws, putting partisan advantage ahead of the best interests of the country. And the decision to go ahead with an EU referendum against a background of deep public anger towards the establishment and a cry for real change was a reckless and irresponsible gamble. At no point, though, did Ruth Davidson attempt to make any arguments against either of these approaches. Today, with the Tory government in Westminster without a plan and Britain facing a hard Brexit, Ruth Davidson sticks with defending them, rather than offering an alternative for how Scotland can best deal with leaving the European Union. The Scottish Conservative Party is claiming to protect a union it is in fact putting it at risk, after allowing the UK to fall out of another union that provided jobs and opportunities that enhanced our economy. And that is part of the reason I believe that the biggest risk Scotland faces, along with independence, is a Tory hard Brexit and a Scottish Conservative Party that is doing nothing to overcome the divisions of the referendum and everything to exploit those divisions. In July, when I first laid out Scottish Labour's response to Brexit, I made absolutely clear that we would support the work of the First Minister as she was undertaking to protect Scotland's place in Europe. I did that because I believe in protecting our relationship with Europe is essential for the future prosperity of our country. We need to be able to take advantage of the opportunities on our own doorstep. But I also did it because our relationship with Europe isn't just a transactional one. It's about identity, my own and that of so many other Scots. My belief in the European project, from working closely with our friends and neighbours to the benefits of free movement, has been core to my politics and that of many people in the Labour Party. That's why I've worked in good faith with the First Minister since June on these issues, and we have had weekly debates in the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Government's proposals before Christmas contain a number of ideas which need to be explored with the UK Government, and I very much hope that they are on the table for the joint ministerial meeting this Thursday. Regardless of Scotland's final relationship with Europe, though, the First Minister has now accepted something that she did not on the day after the EU referendum. She's accepted that Scotland will find itself outside of the European Union, even if a deal is struck to maintain a relationship within the single market. The focus of the Scottish Government now should be on getting the best possible deal for Scotland out of these negotiations, not on continuing to make the case for a second independence referendum. Now, the First Minister has changed her position on this several times over recent months. First, she said in her manifesto that Brexit would be a possible trigger for another referendum. And then most recently, she ruled it out for the next 12 months. Having ruled it out in 2017, this now means that a second independence referendum would need to take place between January 2018 and March 2019, when the Article 50 negotiations conclude. A referendum after that date would mean potentially leaving Scotland outside of the EU and outside of the United Kingdom, a set of circumstances that would see us lose the economic relationship with both of our largest trading partners. So if the First Minister is serious about getting the best deal for Scotland, there is only one thing that she should do: take the threat of a second independence referendum off the table entirely. This would be in the national interest and would put the opinion of a majority of Scots ahead of our own supporters. Because here are the facts. Nicola Sturgeon knows that a second independence referendum in the next few years would fail. She also knows that a quarter of people who voted for her in 2015 would vote no, that Brexit has made people less willing to take a leap into the dark. And crucially, the majority of the Scottish public do not want a second referendum anytime soon. As a nation, we are already divided enough. We do not want to be divided again. And if the UK is set to suffer from the uncertainty created by Brexit, as businesses question making investments in the United Kingdom, we cannot afford for Scotland to appear to be an even more unstable prospect. If the First Minister wants to have a referendum while Scotland is still inside the EU, that means the country would face another divisive independence referendum while the UK negotiates with Europe. It would mean people across Scotland voting to leave our biggest trading partner with no knowledge of what the UK deal with the EU might look like. It would be as reckless as David Cameron's original gamble of an EU referendum. And it would be a proposal that Labour in the Scottish Parliament would vote against. Leaving the EU, whether we retain single market access or not, means that the whole structure of political decision-making in the United Kingdom is going to change. Whether we like it or not, questions about how we run our affairs are going to be central in the coming years. Since Britain joined the common market and then the European Union, more and more powers have transferred to Brussels to enable us to work cooperatively with members of the Union. Leaving the EU means many areas of law and policy will return to the United Kingdom. This will probably be the single biggest change to the UK's governance since devolution itself. Currently, the Prime Minister and the UK government have no plan to deal with it, apart from a Great Repeal Act, which appears to be nothing more than an initiative to grab a headline. For progressives who believe that this country needs radical change, and for the public who have been demanding it, this is an opportunity. I am against independence and I am pro-union, but that doesn't mean I'm pro the status quo. Any politician who believes the solution to our problems lies in no change just hasn't been listening hard enough. The return of powers from Brussels gives us the opportunity to think afresh about how our country is run. And for me, that means convening a People's Constitutional Convention. The experience of the Scottish Constitutional Convention in the 1980s and early 1990s showed that it doesn't take government to create a popular movement for change. It takes people working together around a common vision and a common idea. Yes, the power of government ultimately makes the vision a reality, but if it wasn't for the will and the determination of Civic Scotland, church leaders and opposition politicians in the 1980s, devolution may have vanished after the failed referendum in 1979. Last month, I presented my proposal for a People's Constitutional Convention, and I wrote to Theresa May encouraging her to do just that. Instead of the future of our country being determined behind closed doors in Westminster, it should be determined by the people of this country. The government's response to my letter was to reject it out of hand. I believe it now falls to the Labour Party across the UK to convene a constitutional convention to determine how government across the UK will work after Brexit. And I was pleased to see Jeremy Corbyn back the idea again just yesterday on the Andrew Marr show. It is for us in Scotland to determine how we best manage our affairs and our future here, but we need to play a full part in any process to reform the United Kingdom. And this is not constitutional change for the sake of it. We are faced with the prospect of one of the biggest upheavals in our governance arrangements that we have ever seen. And we cannot and would not want to escape that debate. This is an opportunity to respond to the circumstances that led to Brexit and to put Labour values into practice. It is now widely accepted that the inequality that exists between different parts of our country is not just unpalatable, it is holding our country back. Having a productive and growing economy relies on every part of the United Kingdom firing on all cylinders, not just in one corner. Our contribution to this debate has to be rooted in building our economy for the future and ensuring opportunities are spread across all parts of the United Kingdom and indeed all parts of Scotland. As a starting point, there are 3 areas where I believe it is important that Scotland starts to look at taking its responsibility for. The first is in the basic protections and guarantees around employment. The European Union has provided a backstop for protections, but when the social chapter ceases to apply here, we have to ask where that power best sits. And I would argue that the United Kingdom should continue to set a basic standard for the whole of the United Kingdom, but different parts of the United Kingdom should be able to build on those across the country. So the Scottish Parliament would be able to build on a common UK standard, should it wish to. The same principle should also apply to the minimum wage. A national floor should be set, above which the devolved institutions across the United Kingdom would be able to increase the national minimum wage. The second area is in fisheries and agriculture. In this, as in a number of other policy areas, we should not undermine the devolution settlement by seeing the UK government take responsibility for areas of policy which are clearly devolved. If an area of policy is not contained in Schedule 5 of the Scotland Act, then it should return not to London, but to Edinburgh. Fisheries and agriculture may still require coordination across the United Kingdom, but this should be done in a negotiation between governments of the UK as equals. Finally, we need to seriously consider the case for decisions about immigration to be taken at a more local level, along the lines of the model that is in place in Canada. This would allow different parts of the United Kingdom to have immigration policy that meets their particular needs. And Scotland's needs in this regard are stark, not least in the university sector, and I think the argument for that is compelling. The Fresh Talent Initiative, which was developed by the last Labour-led Scottish Executive, set the precedent that there can be a different immigration arrangement for Scotland, and it is disappointing that there hasn't been the political will to make anything similar happen recently. This proposal is attractive and one that Scottish Labour will look at in more detail in the coming months, along with colleagues from Canada and Quebec. And we will also look in detail at the recommendations of the All-Party Group on Social Integration, which reported last week. New governance arrangements across the UK that give a greater role to devolved institutions would create a new phase of devolution for our country. And I believe this has to sit alongside a restatement of the partnership between Scotland and the UK in a new Act of Union to modernise our union for a new age. Too many of our discussions about further devolution in Scotland have been reduced to an auction around powers. What we need instead is a discussion that meets the desires of a majority of people across Scotland. A strong Scotland with more power to determine our future, whilst maintaining and strengthening our relationship with the rest of the UK. This is what a new Act of Union would enable us to do, to spell out in detail the renewed relationship between Scotland and the nations of the United Kingdom. It would make clear that our country is a partnership of equals where the 4 nations of our country pool sovereignty in order to maximise opportunity, and where being part of the UK continues to guarantee certain rights and privileges on which we can build. I believe this is an ambitious agenda for change, which is in line with what the majority of people across Scotland want. Pro-union, but not pro-status quo. Equipping Scotland with what it will need to prosper in a post-Brexit environment. But we also need to be ambitious about the powers that we have now. And after years of debate and discussion, our Parliament is now more powerful than it has ever been. And as we are faced the prospect of Brexit, we should not just be thinking about what it means for our institutions, but what the Scottish Government could be doing now in order to put us in the best position for that future. Even before Brexit, the challenges we faced as a nation were immense. And in many respects, Brexit does not change that. We still face challenges to grow our economy, increase the productivity of our labour force, and open up new opportunities for the Scottish economy. According to the independent experts in the Scottish Parliament Information Centre, the Scottish Government has missed its targets on growth, productivity, and labour market participation. With more and more of the Scottish economy being owned by foreign-based companies, we need to look at how sustainable this makes our economy in the future and whether new models of ownership, such as cooperatives and mutuals, could bring ownership closer to home. If I were in the Scottish Government, this is what would be keeping me awake at night. Over the coming months, I will have more to say about how Scottish Labour believes we can build a more productive economy. But before I conclude this evening, I want to lay out 3 changes I believe the Scottish Government needs to make to give our country the best chance to succeed in the near future. The first is the action they can take during the budget process in the coming weeks. After the elections in May, I appointed myself as Scottish Labour's finance spokesperson because of the importance I place on the choices that the Scottish Parliament now faces in this budget. This is the first budget where MSPs will be able to make full decisions on income tax, therefore placing with the Scottish Government the power to increase tax revenues if it so wishes. The current budget proposal from the Government would see hundreds of millions of pounds of cuts, which would have a devastating effect on our communities. This comes after years of cuts have placed more and more strain on our public services. So my priority in this budget is for the Government to use the powers they have to reverse these cuts. If we want resilient communities that can face the challenges of the future, we need to pay for it. And Scottish Labour has made the choice to be honest with people. And we have explained why we are asking everyone to pay a little more and those at the top to pay the most. The SNP government cannot continue to complain about the consequences of austerity if it is not willing to take any action to stop it. The proposed budget also means continued cuts to Scotland's schools, as local authorities are forced to make ends meet. Cutting the budgets of Scotland's schools when our economy faces significant challenges is totally irresponsible. It doesn't just limit the opportunities of the current generation, it will harm our economy in the future. Every employer I meet tells me of the need to improve the Scottish education system, and in some of the fastest growing industries, I meet employers who have to look outside of Scotland to find the skills that they need. This can't go on. Since 2007, the SNP have presided over an education system that has seen 4,000 teachers lost, along with fewer support staff in our schools. And in our colleges, there are 152,000 fewer places now than when the SNP came to government nearly 10 years ago. So while funding to tackle the attainment gap is welcome, it can't make up for the cuts of the past decade. I always talk about the money that we want to raise to stop the cuts to our schools as an investment, because we are investing in the skills of the next generation of workers, which is the key building block of a stronger economy in the future. And if people are the first ingredient of a successful economy, place is the second. In Scotland, we are blessed with a number of dynamic and innovative cities, from Inverness and Aberdeen in the north to Glasgow and Edinburgh further south. The geographic distribution of our cities means that there is a potential engine for economic growth in every corner of our country. and we need to be in the best position to take advantage of that. The city deals which have been awarded across Scotland so far have and will inject millions of pounds into local economies, and in the future will go some way to unlock even more potential. But we have to be even more ambitious. The UK Government's commitment to provide a city deal to every Scottish city cannot be a wasted opportunity. The Labour-led local authorities in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen and Stirling are to be commended for leading the work to secure these city deals. And I want to see that same level of ambition from the Scottish Government. This Scottish Government needs to ditch the timid managerialism which seems to have become its hallmark and start taking more lessons from pioneers such as Tom Johnson, who left us the legacy of hydroelectricity. Government should be thinking radically about how we make the most of our cities and thinking big. So let's not trumpet a 10-minute reduction in the time it takes to get a train from Glasgow to Edinburgh. Let's start thinking aloud about how we could create an intercity network to connect our cities together in even less time. We have an engineering hub in Aberdeen where it is easier and often quicker to travel to London by air than it is to Edinburgh by rail. Why aren't we talking about changing that? In Glasgow, campaigners have called for a crossrail service for years and properly integrated transport across the whole city region. The government should be looking at how we can make that a reality. And in Edinburgh, we have a successful tech sector and a well-established finance sector working alongside each other. What more can we do in order to get them working properly together so we can take advantage of the burgeoning opportunities and expertise in fintech, for example? Absolutely none of this will happen by accident. It takes political will and a proper strategy owned by an individual in government to drive it forward. That is why it is so disappointing when the evidence that cities drive growth is so persuasive that the Scottish Government has no dedicated cities minister. In fact, the word cities, which long appeared in the title of at least one cabinet member, has been dropped entirely. Appointing a dedicated cities minister would be a strong signal that driving growth through our cities is a priority for this government. And finally, we need to stop opportunities passing us by. The government has been very successful at saving industries at risk. But when it comes to identifying growing industries and helping them to succeed, the picture is less positive. For example, in the North East, we risk losing jobs in decommissioning to the north of England, as there is simply not enough political will to make that vision a reality. There is potentially £18 billion of work in this industry between now and 2025. And if we do not turn our attention to it, other parts of the United Kingdom will be the first to reap the benefits of that work. Similarly, the risk of automation in middle-class professions poses a risk to jobs we never thought were at risk of being replaced by machines. Many processes in finance have already disappeared and been replaced by computer algorithms, and in the law, software already exists to replace costly humans when it comes to document reviews. The same is true of other industries, which we always thought were off the limits to machines. How will we respond to this? The first wave of automation destroyed industries that Scotland relied upon. This latest wave cannot be allowed to do the same. So if innovative tech is to replace these skilled jobs, we need to be at the leading edge of that sector. And we're in a great position to do it. Scotland already has a leading tech sector and the UK's largest tech incubator in Codebase here in Edinburgh, with nearly 80 startups based in just one building. But what support is being offered to these businesses to stay if they continue to grow? And how are we expanding that out to the rest of the country, ensuring locally based support and not more centralisation as we are witnessing with the proposed changes to Highlands and Islands Enterprise? As the very nature of business changes, has the government's means of supporting those businesses kept up? How will we reap the benefits of this being right here on our doorstep? Our government has published no strategy on how we take advantage of these new opportunities, despite being in a perfect position to be able to do so. This isn't a consequence of a lack of power. It's a consequence of a lack of political will. In the 1980s, the answer to decline in manufacturing was Silicon Glen, and at its peak, Scotland produced 30% of Europe's PCs, 80% of its workstations, and 65% of its ATMs. Competition on the grounds of cost meant that many of these industries moved away. But the tech jobs of the future won't be won on the basis of low-cost labour. The jobs we need to win are high-quality and high-skilled jobs, which rely on having a long-term strategy from government and a highly educated workforce ready to take these opportunities on. Scotland can and should be the centre of tech innovation in the future. As we approach a decade of SNP control in Holyrood, my thoughts are turning to the next 10 years. And these questions about the future of our young people and how we build a growing and successful economy after Brexit are the ones that will preoccupy me. We live in a time of binary politics, where we are identified by our choices at referenda, remain or leave, yes or no, and where too often our politicians leave to those the divides for political advantage. My argument tonight has been that this is not only short-sighted, it is dangerous and destructive. Labour has never succeeded when it looks at the world as it is and argues for no change, or is in any way satisfied with the political debate as we find it. Throughout our history, we have always been the party of bold and radical change, achieved in a progressive and pragmatic way. We have always been the people who look for the political road less travelled and achieve real progress. And the evidence is that we've been pretty good at it when given the chance. The NHS, the welfare state, the Scottish Parliament, all proud achievements of my party, achieved through rational debate and pragmatic thinking. Our challenge now is to show that progressive politics, where we work together to find solutions to our common problems, can win against populism, whether that's in the form of right-wing parties or in the form of nationalist parties. I will leave you with this thought. 4 days from now, Donald Trump will stand on the steps of the US Capitol and be sworn in as the 45th President of the United States. I still can't quite believe it. He is one of the least qualified people ever to take this office, but from Friday, he will be at the head of the most powerful government in the world. 4 years from now, I want to look back on this as the high watermark of the populist wave which has swept through the Western democracies. But progressives won't win by sitting still. Whether you're a member of the Labour Party, the US Democrats, the French Socialists, or the Social Democratic Party in Germany, the challenges we face are all the same. I believe the left can win through, not just by showing our ideas can triumph, but also by demonstrating that our vision of working together towards a common goal is fundamental to how most people on this planet want to live their lives. As David Hume wrote, it's when we start working together that the real healing takes place. Thank you.
Kezia, thank you very much indeed for that. There was a lot to think about there, a lot perhaps for members of the audience to ask you to expand on or to take issue with. We've got about half an hour, a little more, for questions and answers. Could I ask you, when you ask your questions, to do just that? Don't make speeches. If you make speeches, that leaves less time for questions. And if you could be pretty clear in what you want Kezia to direct her attentions to, I think that would go down well. Certainly go down well with me, and I think it would go down well with the rest of the audience. So who wants to start us off? There are roving mics. Lady right in the middle there. You can hold the mic close to your lips.
Can everyone hear me?
That's it. Terrific.
Rhea Chris, RSPB Scotland. Glad to hear that you mentioned CAP and CFP. What I wanted to ask is, seeing as the climate change plan will be announced on Thursday and that climate change and nature don't respect boundaries and we still have international requirements. I was wondering what your thoughts were on the birds and habitat directives and the government's announcement that they'd like to retain and enhance them, and whether this will help the rest of the 4 countries avoid a regulatory rush to the bottom.
In the context of Brexit? Or?
Yes, please.
Okay. I'm doing them individually.
If we've got other hands up, we'll take a couple of questions. Lady there, then gentleman at the back, and then I'll take another 3 after that.
Hi there, Katrina Webster from the Press Association. In an interview last week, Jeremy Corbyn suggested that it would be very difficult for Scotland or other parts of the UK to have their own immigration policy. Have you managed to change his mind on that?
Gentleman right at the back.
Yeah, Roy Leckie. I'm an investor. So a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. I'd like to ask if you think that Scotland needs more higher and additional rate taxpayers, and if there's any evidence you can point to that suggests that a significant tax rate differential between Scotland and the rest of the UK would serve Scotland well.
Kezia.
Okay, we'll start with the last one in reverse. I think the reverse of your question is also true, which is I haven't seen any substantial evidence to suggest that a higher rate of tax in Scotland would drive people away. Specifically, when you look at the number of people in Scotland who earn over the threshold where a 50p tax rate would apply. I can't actually see the gentleman that asked the last question, trying to make eye contact with you at the back there. So that 16,000 people at the last count in Scotland are earning over the threshold where a 50p tax rate would apply. When you look at the detail of those individuals, many of them are actually senior public sector workers. So that idea of flight across borders doesn't look like it would happen in practice. Many of them are university principals. I'm looking at a few people in the front row here. Sorry, I shouldn't joke. But there is a point here about, is it purely a question of tax and the money in the individual's pocket that drives this type of cultural change or attitudinal change to the decisions you make about your own life? Because what I'm trying to do in Scotland is to say, look, if you don't like austerity politics, there is another way. And that's a very simplistic but powerful principled argument about the choices we make in government. But actually, if I had to make that argument on the doorstep to somebody in Morningside who does earn over that salary bracket and would pay this extra tax, I would talk in a different way. I would talk about the social contract that we have as citizens in a country. So if we want, universal high-quality public services, we have to have a conversation about how we pay for them. And if we don't, if we want the market to be increasingly involved in the provision of our public services, well then, that's what you believe. I choose to take a different view. So I'm making an argument that things like a very strong and protected NHS, world-class universities, free tuition, free prescriptions, universal early learning and childcare, many of the things that we have in Scotland that there aren't elsewhere in the United Kingdom, are part of a social contract that we're all bought into, but the price of maintaining that in the future might be that some people with broader shoulders have to pay more tax. So that's the argument that I would make around the additional top rate. To Katrina and the question of immigration, I saw Jeremy Corbyn be asked about that when he was doing a round of regional media interviews. What he said was he couldn't see how it could work. But I actually think there's lots of people across the United Kingdom who have ideas about how it could work. We've got the example in the past of the Fresh Talent Initiative about how you can have a scheme which is specifically tied to universities. Another example that I've talked to Keir Starmer about, Labour's Brexit minister, is about employer-related economic migration. So you could have a system in Scotland which was linked to employers in Scotland, for example. But let's have the conversation. And when you look at the detail of Scotland's ageing population, the requirements that we have in particular industries and sectors at different times of the year for particular skills and the workforce that we need, there's a compelling argument there for Scotland to have the ability to have economic migration suited to its needs. And I think the very least we owe ourselves, if we're serious about growing Scotland's economy, is a conversation about how we might be able to do that. And then the final question there about from the RSPB. As I said in the speech, the attitude that I'm putting forward in my proposals for a People's Constitutional Convention and everything I've said about federalism is based on the principle of what is not in Schedule 5 should be devolved. So in that sense, everything around the environment and agriculture would come to the Scottish Parliament. The important point about that is we then decide what we want to do with that. That then becomes a decision for the Scottish Parliament. So if we want to maintain those standards and directives that you describe, or indeed go further, that becomes a political choice made in the Scottish Parliament by members of the Scottish Parliament. And in that, I think you would find my environment spokesperson, Claudia Beamish, very open to the arguments that you would make as to why you might want to maintain or indeed enhance some of these measures. If you wanted to have a more detailed conversation about that, I'll pass you on to Claudia.
Thank you very much. Lady there, and anybody else with hands up, and then there's a gentleman just behind, and Gavin just there.
Thank you very much. Vanessa Glynn from the European Movement in Scotland. Thank you, Kezia, for a very thoughtful speech full of lots of ideas. Some of the proposals you make, particularly repatriation of powers from Brussels, suggests that you have accepted it will be a hard Brexit out of the single market. Is that now the position of the Labour Party across the UK? I had understood that that was still to be decided, that if there was a vote in Parliament, then Keir Starmer was proposing to put a plan together to not necessarily accept that we should come out of the single market and the customs union. I'd be grateful for your clarification.
Thank you. Gentleman just three rows back, I think. And I am coming back to you, Gavin.
Jamie Livingston from Oxfam, Scotland. Kezia, at this session before the Scottish elections, I raised economic inequality with you, and I'm pleased to hear you raising it again. Today, we released a new report showing that globally, just 8 people now have the same wealth as half of the world's population put together. Yet the world has committed to ending extreme poverty, and we think those two things go hand in hand. Given that context, given that we know that this is a global challenge, but that serious change needs to happen at national level, will you join with me in welcoming the plans for an inequality commission in 2017-18? Will you push for that to be set up with the level of ambition that needs to match the consistent cross-party concern about economic inequality in Scotland? And given what you said about tax, would you point to any particular areas you would want the Commission to focus on? Thank you.
Gavin McCrone. I would like you, Kezia, just to expand a bit on what you said about how Scotland should deal with Brexit. If we remain part of the United Kingdom, as you've argued we should, and as I think many people would wish, how far can we modify whatever line the UK government takes over Brexit? I mean, what concerns me is that we have been dependent for a very long time on foreign investment. We have been in acute competition with Ireland for that, and with Spain and other places. Not being part of the European single market will mean we lose out on that very seriously, in my view. And I don't know how you modify that. I mean, the SNP government have argued that we can have a different sort of Brexit in Scotland from what there is in England. That seems to me a bit doubtful, but what's your view on that?
I mean, I think that last point is the key one. I said in the speech that since June, I've endeavoured to work as closely as possible with the First Minister because we share the common goal of wanting to maintain as close a relationship with the European Union as we possibly can, as close to what we have at the moment, for example. We've had, I think now, 13 different debates in the Scottish Parliament around Europe and the impact of the referendum result on Scotland. The 14th is tomorrow. The only time we have ever departed from supporting the government in these debates and the Scottish Government's position was in the one debate where the Scottish Government tried to infer that Scotland's relationship with Europe was more important than its relationship with the rest of the United Kingdom, particularly when it came to trade, to investment, to jobs and the economy. And we felt at that moment we had to part ways because whilst we will support endeavours to maintain that relationship with Europe, we have to recognise that actually our biggest trading partner is the rest of the United Kingdom, that in the last 2 years or so we've just reaffirmed our commitment to that United Kingdom and that we need to have these two parallel processes, which is why I'm very careful at all points to urge the First Minister not to use what she's trying to do around the EU referendum result to build the case for a second independence referendum, because at that point, the good faith that we've invested in her turns into bad faith. There's another type of faith involved in all of this, though, and that's blind faith, in that right at the start of June, the First Minister promised all the opposition party leaders that she would be as open and transparent as she possibly could about the types of discussions she was having with the rest of the UK government and indeed other European countries. I've not received one bit of paper at any point in that 6 or 7 month period. So, you know, it's urging towards the blind faith now rather than the good faith aspect of that. And you'll be aware that the First Minister published a Brexit action plan just before the Christmas recess began. And again, there's much in that which I would agree with in principle, but there was very little detail about the practical reality of making it happen. I often see the First Minister and indeed the SNP suggest that this conversation we're having about Europe is one determined by the Westminster government, and forgets that whilst the Westminster government obviously has an important role to play in this, there are 27 other countries of Europe that will have a thought or two about what Scotland's relationship with Europe might be, or what indeed the United Kingdom's deal with the rest of Europe might be. This isn't a binary conversation, a transaction between two bodies. It's much more multifaceted than that, and very, very complicated. To Vanessa, I hope you didn't take from that in any sense that I support hard Brexit. I do fear that's what we're faced with, however. I think we'll get a stronger indication of that tomorrow when the Prime Minister rises to her feet, but all of the trailing of what she's going to say tomorrow from the Sunday newspapers suggests the very worst version of Brexit to somebody like me who passionately campaigned for a Remain vote. So I think it's very important that we wait to see what she has to say about that. You know, the focus for the Labour Party in all of this is to try and work as hard as possible to get the best possible deal for the United Kingdom. Now, I believe that the best possible deal for the United Kingdom has to include the best possible deal for Scotland, because I voted to remain part of the United Kingdom. We are part of the United Kingdom. It isn't this some other body, some other place. It is us. So we are trying to get the best possible deal for the United Kingdom, faced with very, very stark circumstances. I've sat down with Keir Starmer to talk about the detail of this on a number of occasions. He's back in Scotland again later in January. I'm in constant contact with him. As a former Director of Public Prosecutions for England and Wales, he does the detail very, very well. And I think you'll see him respond in very, very stark, detailed way tomorrow whenever we hear just exactly the direction of travel that we're going to get from the Prime Minister. And just to answer Jamie's question, I'm going to say yes and yes for the first two and panic my advisor at the back of the room, because he won't know just exactly what you're asking me to sign up to, but I don't think there's much you can oppose to in an inequality commission. In terms of what it should look at, it has to look at the question of tax. Now, that could be personal taxation, or it could be much broader than that. It could be about land value taxes, business taxes, VAT, for example. You know, one of the consequences of Brexit could be that we can do more interesting things with VAT than we've been able to do in the past because of EU regulations. So absolutely have to have a conversation about tax, but I think it has to be a principled one based on what type of country do we want to live in and how do we want to achieve those ends. And if we want to have high quality public services, we cannot avoid having that conversation about tax. We also have to recognise that asking the richest to pay more, whilst it's something I support and it's at the root of my politics of, you know, redistribution of wealth, in and of itself isn't enough to stop austerity. We have to have harder conversations with middle earners about whether we believe they are paying enough tax for the things that we value. I actually asked our team of researchers in the Parliament to do some work on this just before Christmas, to look at the impact of the varying levels of personal income tax thresholds and the changes to the minimum income thresholds that the Tories have introduced over the past few years. And I've saved several £100s as an MSP on a salary of £60,000 from 2010 till now. I'm paying less tax now than I was in 2010. I find that offensive as somebody who stands up in the Parliament every week and makes the case for investment in public services. So let's have that conversation about tax. And I think if, you know, politicians aren't honest enough to do it, then we're simply going to continue to kick this debate into the long grass.
Thanks, Kezia. I think there was one in these. We were like an auctioneer up here. You know, some people just raise an eyebrow, and then gentlemen there.
Thanks. Hi, Kez.
Hands are better.
Hi, Kezia. Ross Martin from SCDI. You rightly mentioned the role of cities and the surrounding regions in terms of engines for the economy. Can you say a word or two about what needs to happen in terms of empowering those cities? Because over the years since devolution, we've seen very little power transfer either from Westminster or from Holyrood to our cities.
Yeah.
Gentleman right in the middle there, please.
Yeah, David Gow. Hello? Yep.
Yep,
David Gow. Sceptical Scot and Social Europe. Could I ask you, you talked a bit about populism, Kezia, and but you seem to conflate right-wing populism with what you might call kind of more leftish type populism, as if somehow it's all the same thing, so that Scottish nationalism is not that distant, or is the same as effectively Trumpism, or indeed, you know, Nicola Sturgeon is a tartan-wearing Marine Le Pen, or Frauke Petry.
I definitely didn't say that for the benefit of PA.
of the Frauke Petry of the Alternative für Deutschland. So first of all, could you explain a bit more about, you know, why you're so hostile to populism across the piece, and secondly, if there is indeed a hard Brexit and we end up in the kind of UK that Philip Hammond was talking about in his discussions with Welt am Sonntag yesterday, i.e., as a kind of low wage dumped tax haven offshore of the kind of a kind of what I call Singapore on the Atlantic, doesn't that make you want to rethink the whole business of being a part of the UK, because you couldn't achieve any of the policies you put forward by being within that kind of economy and/or society?
Is there a third question, since I've been taking them in threes? Okay, you can think about it while Kezia is answering these two. Kezia.
Just to start with David's question, in the last part of that, Philip Hammond, no, it doesn't make me rethink my commitment to the United Kingdom. It makes me more committed to pursuing the federal solution which I'm arguing for, because in that scenario, I would want those powers to be in the hands of the Scottish Parliament to make different choices. So we can choose in the Scottish Parliament not to pursue a low-wage economy, to make the types of different decisions that I'm seeking to argue for. And in addition to that, you know, I don't believe in the United Kingdom for its own sake. I believe in the United Kingdom because of its ability to redistribute wealth and power. So I don't accept just now that we are very good under the current Tory government at redistributing that wealth, but it doesn't mean that it's not possible. You know, during the referendum, I argued for remaining part of the United Kingdom because I wanted to tax the wealth in London and the South East and redistribute it into Craigmillar and Wester Hailes and Sighthill. That was the Labour argument about pooling and sharing resources across the United Kingdom. So I believe in the United Kingdom because of its ability to do that, if that's the path that we choose for it. But on the question of, you know, populism, the issue I take with your question was that you described the SNP's version of nationalism in that as leftish. Now, I know it's not very popular to say that the SNP aren't a left-wing party, but I don't believe they are a left-wing party. And my reason for that is I can't point to any progressive policies that they advocate or have advocated in the 10 years that they've been in power. In fact, quite the reverse is true. Whenever the SNP have talked about tax over the last 10 years, it's to argue for a tax cut. Whether that even be as simple as the council tax freeze, which was a policy which disproportionately benefited middle-class families because they were more likely to live in houses worth more money, so therefore saved more cash. Same goes for corporation tax or business rates. The same goes for the current debate we're having just now about air passenger duty, where the SNP's attitude to a new power to vary tax is to cut it. So it really frustrates me when we get into the debate about progressive alliances, because I don't accept fundamentally that the Scottish National Party are a progressive party. I believe there are progressives within it. I believe there are left-wing politicians within it, but I don't accept that the party itself is inherently left-wing. So that's where I would dispute the essence of your question. And, you know, I believe in radical progressive politics where you take bold decisions to choose to do things differently. And I can't think of anything that's radically significant that the SNP have done in policy terms, putting aside the tax argument in those 10 years. It's been a managerial decade. And I think we're starting to see the consequences of that. Ross, on the question of cities, you know, I think the Labour Party's been very consistent for a long time now at saying that devolution isn't between parliaments, that it's not just about devolving power from the Palace of Westminster to Holyrood. It's about devolving power from the Scottish Parliament down to local authorities, and indeed from local authorities down to local communities. I'm a big fan of the ideas and the schemes that we've seen around participative democracy, where you actually give money to communities to determine priorities within local areas. You can't do that everywhere all of the time, but it's definitely something we should do more of. And I think we can devolve substantially more economic powers from the Scottish Parliament to local authorities, and we can get much better than we currently are at joining up some of those economic powers to deliver for the regional circumstances that certain areas require. So to be able to link what happens around college places and schools with business rates and the skills needs of a local economy, or particularly in areas where there are huge or still substantially large employers that are very dominant. I think there's a lot more we can do at a local authority to reflect regional economic circumstances to drive that type of economic growth. But the point remains that won't happen by accident. It'll happen because somebody drove it. It requires that political will. Now, very often that's come in the form of a radical reforming council leader. And you'd expect me to say it, but I think some of those leading voices have been Labour voices, in part because it's Labour leaders who are leading many of our cities in areas where you are seeing that transformative change. But without the political will and the focus, it won't happen, which is why I'm arguing for a cities minister at Scottish Government level as well, to try and encourage that type of behaviour and response across the country.
Thank you. Hey, who's next, please? Gentleman there. Anybody else? There's a kind of silent quarter here that doesn't say a word yet. Just saying, you know. and the gentleman here, and there's Professor Gallagher in the front here.
Hi, good evening. Martin Fairbairn from the Scottish Funding Council. I hope you would agree, and this is not me just being speaking on behalf of the Scottish Funding Council, education is key to responding to what you described as a radically new economy. And I wonder if we need to think radically differently about how our education system prepares our young people for a very different future economy. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Gentleman just here.
Chris Carr, Edinburgh University. Kezia, I'm not quite clear how you as an opposition party are really holding the government to account on the form of the Brexit process. I mean, once they call that in March Article 50, I don't quite see how you really have any more say. If at one extreme a miracle occurs and they come up with a really fantastic deal that gives the cake and eat it situation that some were promised of, they get at least some access to the market. That's one extreme. At the other extreme, they get absolutely nothing and it's a hard Brexit and we're out. What can you then do? I mean, it seems it's in the interest of Europe. Once they know that we've called Article 50, they will want to concede nothing because they want to set an example. It's hard to see how they've got any incentive to offer us anything in that negotiation process. So what happens if they do come back with the worst possible outcome? What can you then do? I mean, the Liberals are saying, well, maybe we could somehow rescind Article 50 by getting a rather quirky legal argument to say maybe we could withdraw Article 50 later. But what can you actually do later? How can you hold the government to account?
And Jim Gallagher in front.
Kezia, Jim Gallagher, it won't be a surprise to you that I agree with a lot of what you had to say there on the Constitution. But there's one area which you didn't touch on, and which might be a challenge that was made to you. And that is that the federal or confederal notions that you've described don't give any formal recognition to the fact that Scotland, as a nation, voted one way, whereas England and Wales voted the other. In other words, that Scotland's position, its policy position on Europe is rather different. And I wonder if you agree that a way of dealing with that would be to increase the competence of the Scottish Parliament to enter into European relations itself in respect of devolved matters, whatever those devolved matters are.
The answer to that is yes. And actually the speech that I gave to the IPPR back in early December did have a reference to that. I'm sorry to disappoint you, Jim, but lots of people didn't find that particularly exciting. That must just be you and I, but it means that it's right, of course. But I think it's one of these issues which might not strike us now as terribly important or obvious, but will increasingly become so. So to have identified it and to be thinking along those lines now should give us the advantage in the debate that we're trying to have. That was for the same reasons I think I was the first leader of a Scottish political party to stand up and say, look, we're leaving Europe, what we're going to do with these powers when they come back, when much of the world was still trying to cope with the actual result of the EU referendum itself. Chris, I sense that you don't feel particularly optimistic about the situation that we're faced with. I would love to think otherwise, but until I hear from the Prime Minister tomorrow, I suspect that you may be right. I think a lot hangs on what the Supreme Court rules in terms of to what degree can Parliament and therefore to what degree can opposition politicians influence an outcome is, as we know, stuck in the court process. And I've been very careful not to hypothesize about that because it's undoubtedly a question of law rather than a question of politics. So I'll wait to see what the Supreme Court says about that before I respond to that in a political sense. I think to try and do that before the Supreme Court gets you into very murky and difficult territory. So I don't have a better answer for you than that, other than to say I think you have to be very careful in the climate that we currently live in, where trust in politicians and the political process is as low as it is to do anything which jeopardizes the democratic will of the people. And when I say the will of the people, I talk about the franchise of the United Kingdom, which voted to leave the European Union. I think it would be very difficult to do anything in the face of that because of what that represents, which was asking the people what they thought. You can't then choose to ignore the answer. Could you imagine if we'd done that on the question of independence in Scotland? So, sorry, Vanessa.
I was going to say the question on the ballot paper was about leaving the EU, not about leaving the single market of the EU.
Yeah, absolutely. You are right in that regard.
I would like to know what Labour's position is.
Well, it's very clear in the sense that we would want free tariff access to the single market. I don't think you've heard...
Every country has access. It's not the same as being a member or being in the EU.
No, I understand that. I do understand the difference. And Martin's point about the Funding Council, from the Funding Council about education in general, I see the Tories starting to go into this territory now where they're saying, let's rip up the education system and start again. We've just gone through a big process of change around curriculum for excellence, the roots of which lie back in 2004 when Peter Peacock was the education minister, and it's taken us that long to implement it throughout the school system to the point it's only in the past 2 or 3 years it's applying in the secondary system. So I don't think we should be going for another big radical overhaul of the school system. I support curriculum for excellence. I think the principles of curriculum for excellence are sound. Actually, they do exactly what you're arguing for, which is try to allow our school system to produce young citizens who are fit for the modern world because they're more flexible and confident and able to adapt. I think we have to recognise that children entering the labour market now, or young people entering the labour market now, aren't going to do one job or have one career. They're probably going to have 4 careers with 7 different employers over their lifetime. That's probably a conservative estimate, actually. So it's about the degree to which we equip them with the skills to transfer from one industry to another that's very important. And that's why I think the money question is also very important. the problem with Curriculum for Excellence, if there is one, is that it isn't currently fulfilling its potential. So if you look at aspects of Curriculum for Excellence like interdisciplinary learning, the idea that you might get a qualification across 3 or 4 different subject areas that's a bit different or a bit interesting, it realistically isn't happening because our teachers are overworked. They have less time to do CPD, to learn these new skills, to produce these types of work programmes or qualifications than before. And it's just not had that space to breathe in the way that we would want it to. Equally, the general funding of education is making that harder. I mean, I speak to teachers all the time who say the minute a teacher's sick, the school basically grinds to a halt because there's no supply budget. How on earth can you have a dynamic education system when the basics like that are being missed so fundamentally? But it's also not just about school. And you'll know that from your background in the Funding Council. Neither is it just about 18 to 24-year-olds going to college or university. Something else that has died in the last 5 to 10 years is actually adult learning and the degree to which we invest in adult learning in Scotland using the power of the state, whether that be community learning and development budgets and councils in terms of night classes and community centres, to the provision of part-time or evening college places. All of that is completely dissipated. So we can't just think now of what we need to teach our kids for when they enter the labour market in 10 years' time. We need to think about all those young adults who now find themselves with a set of qualifications that's perhaps out of date, or indeed those 40, 50-year-old men who've lost a job in a particular industry that is in decline and need to find skills to go and work somewhere else. I think the degree to which we help that particular group is very, very poor, and we can do a lot better than we currently are in that regard.
I want to take another group of 3 questions, and I've got 3 offers. Charlie Jeffrey first, John Brandon there, and the lady right at the back on the right-hand side. Charlie, please.
Thanks. Charlie Jeffrey, University of Edinburgh. I wanted to push on a thought train, which I think Gavin McCrone and Jim Gallagher both opened up, and ask about how far your alignment with the Scottish Government's Brexit paper goes, using the example, which was one of the options set out there, of Scotland having or negotiating its own membership of the single market, while the rest of the UK, led by the UK government, was no longer in that single market. And the question which underlies that really is how much of a border could you envisage between Scotland and England?
Thanks, Charlie. John.
Thank you very much. John Brand, the European Movement in Scotland. Looking at on a rather wider horizon, the situation seems to be at the moment we've had 2 very important votes last year, which were won basically by lies and deception and perhaps some fantasy. We're in a situation where evidence-based policy and evidence-based politics seems almost to be irrelevant. I think this is very worrying because it becomes increasingly difficult to persuade people to do anything on a sound basis. I wonder, first of all, if you would agree with that, and secondly, what do you think we might be able to do to row back?
Lady right at the back on at the end.
Hi, Heather Pugh. I'm standing as a candidate for the council elections next year. I live in an area of high social deprivation, and a lot of the young people in that area left school or college wanting to get a job but not being able to. Would you say it was unreasonable to expect companies who are coming into that area and developing either housing estates or they're talking about putting up a whole new school and various shops and things attached to that? Would you say it was unreasonable to expect those shops and things, the actual building of them, to take a percentage of the pool of workforce from the surrounding area that it's actually going to be in?
I mean, that last question is really interesting because it takes us to questions about the public pound, and not just how we spend it, but how far it goes. So the Labour Party, during the last Scottish Parliament session, I think made 15 or 16 different amendments to the Scottish Government's public procurement bill to try and create the enabling power for the types of things you're arguing for to happen. So, for example, could you say that no public money could go in the form of a contract to a private entity unless it included guaranteeing the living wage, or a percentage of apprenticeships, or the example you used about a certain amount of employees coming from a local area? I'm not aware of that having happened in Scotland before now, but I'm sure I've read about examples of that in the northeast or northwest of England. Oh, was it? Sorry, I'm not aware of the detail of that. You can go further than that, though. You can do things like build in requirements around childcare, for example. So you could use public procurement legislation to say any company that employs more than 200 people has to provide this basic requirement of childcare. So the whole principle of public buying power is one that the Labour Party is absolutely up for pursuing and arguing for. All of those amendments that we put forward at the time were rejected. So many of the powers and abilities to do that don't currently exist. We would have to go through the process of legislating for that again. Some local authorities, though, have found more creative ways of incentivising particular behaviour around things like apprenticeships and the living wage. But we can make it a lot easier for local authorities to do that by giving them the powers to do that. There are other examples around the planning system. If you think about the regeneration of town centres, or indeed, I mean, you're the candidate in the 4th ward, so if I'm thinking of Royston, for example, if you wanted to try and encourage different types of shops to invest in Royston other than bookmakers or pawn shops or charity shops, then you arguably could create a planning system that allowed you to incentivise some behaviour over others. So that takes you all back to the debate around devolving more power from the Scottish Parliament to local authorities and indeed to communities, so that they have the power, should they want to use it, to make those different choices. It's a very long-winded way of saying I agree with you. To John about evidence-based politics, yeah, I completely agree with that analysis. And for a while I despaired about it, thinking, do I have to change how I talk in order to get anywhere here? Do I have to give up on facts too? And that was a political choice that I had to make in the run-up to the 2016 election, where people were saying to me, well, are you sure it's a good idea to go into an election arguing to put up taxes? And if you want the Labour Party to have a better result, surely the one and only thing you should say for the entire election is that you're against independence and a second independence referendum. Now, I could have done that, and we could all debate whether or not that might have led to a different result from a party, but it's not what I came into politics to do. And I wouldn't be able to sort of look at myself in the mirror if that's how I conducted myself as a politician. So I think, you know, there's a nobility to politics still in there somewhere, where good people are driven to do good things by making the types of arguments that I'm trying to do, to say, look, if we want our country to be a certain way, we have to be honest about the journey we have to take to get there. And that is ultimately rooted in evidence. Of course it is. So let's not abandon facts. Let's respect facts. And, you know, I think that's actually in our identity as Scots from the Enlightenment, that we value knowledge and the application of knowledge. And I sort of do despair about where that might take us. Charlie, your point, you're leading me into some very dangerous territory there around borders. I thought we'd left that argument behind us in the independence referendum. So excuse me if I don't hypothesise about the likelihood of a border between Scotland and England. I very much hope it doesn't come to that. You had a more subtle question in there, though, about, you know, to what degree or how long can Labour maintain its desire to support the principles underpinning the First Minister's Brexit plan. I have to say to you again, it all hinges on the evidence. So on paper, it looks like a good plan motivated by good principles. But I need to believe that it's possible. And I still think, especially with Mike Russell, I don't mean to make it personal, but there's a lot of assertion about how things could be if only the political will was there. Well, as I say again, this isn't just a conversation between, you know, Mike Russell and Philip Hammond, or Mike Russell and numerous other UK Conservative ministers. This is a conversation that we have to have as Scotland and the rest of Europe. And I would really like to see a lot more tangible evidence that it is possible for Scotland within the United Kingdom to have such a markedly different relationship from the rest of the nations of the United Kingdom in order to succeed that goal. That doesn't mean I'm against it, or I don't want it, or I don't want to pursue it. It's, if you believe in evidence-based politics, you have to show me a bit more than blind assertion. I don't. That always gets written up as us being sort of negative, but I don't. I think it's just honest in what people expect if we're going to be serious about such a complex issue.
Thanks very much indeed, Kezia. Where's Nazir Mir? Nazir Mir from the Royal Academy, the Young Academy of Scotland, one of the partners in this series, to say some words about the Young Academy and to offer a vote of thanks to Kezia.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you, Kezia. So, good evening, everybody. My name is Nasser Mir. I'm a co-chair of the Young Academy of Scotland. Now, I appreciate I stand between you and the drinks reception outside, and experience tells me that's a very dangerous place to be, so I won't take very long at all. It's just an opportunity to say a few words about the activities of the Young Academy, who have been a co-sponsor of this series as previous series, and I think it's a reflection of Ray and the David Hume Institute's generosity that they allow us to come up here and say a few words at the end of these important talks. Perhaps like most who are maybe not so young, we continue to live here in our parents' house in the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And those of you who have been to previous lectures will know something about our aims, our objectives and our aims and our goals and so on. And so I won't list them here. They're behind me actually on this well-placed poster. But I will just say that we represent a number of different sectors and disciplines that work collaboratively to inform public policy and support Scottish society through our research and through our practical experience. We are made up of medics, of historians, civil servants, engineers, social scientists, physical scientists of all possible kinds, as well as people from the business community and industry here in Scotland. As such, there's always a multitude of activities underway, but here I'll just mention two that I think are particularly relevant. Our Computing in Schools groups are once more running the first LEGO League, which is effectively a schools robotics and artificial intelligence tournament, which last year saw a Scottish team, the West Linton Wasps from West Linton Primary School, crowned the UK and Ireland first LEGO League champions. And they went on to compete in St. Louis in the US, where I think they won a prize for innovation. And I think they also met President Barack Obama. So we're looking forward to similar kinds of successes this year. Secondly, a second activity I draw your attention to has been our ongoing work on the Silent Histories project, which is led by our Arts and Humanities group, which seeks to inform public debate by using the first-person stories of migrants and refugees. These include the narratives of the Irish fleeing famine, the Kinder transport evacuees escaping the Holocaust, Somalis fleeing civil war, and as well as the voices of new Syrian refugees. Now, YAS has created a film and for young people an accompanying schools pack so that we might better grasp how migration in all its forms is anything but novel to Scotland. And I'll just end by mentioning that in May of this year, Scotland will host the General Assembly of the Global Young Academies with members from 58 countries spanning the global north and the global south, and whose focus this year will be on social justice and inequalities. More to come on that, but YAS will be very much at the centre of those activities. Perhaps I can ask you, in the meantime, to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, consult our web pages, and please get in touch, as we're always keen to work with new partners. And Ray's instructed me to also ask you to once more thank Kezia for her talk, and then follow the sound of pouring drinks to the foyer. Thank you very much.
As Nazir said, there's a glass of wine out in the... Only one glass of wine, so you better go out there and fight for it. Out in the reception. Please join us. Thank you.